There was a shrimp boat. It was dinged and nicked and exposed to the weather, and it was run hard aground on a sandbar and was listing to one side. The boat captain, his body was missing. Conducting a homicide investigation where you have no body to look at has a whole set of unique problems. The best way to conduct an investigation is to just let the crime scene tell the story.
The Ocean Clipper had been on a 3-week shrimp run. Her captain was 48-year-old Rolf Bacher. But when Bacher's ship is found with nobody aboard, investigators are confronted with a mystery. Key West, Florida, about as close as you can get to paradise, if you're on vacation. But for the men who make their living fishing for shrimp, it's a hard life, but not usually a dangerous one. Shrimp boat captain Rolf Bacher loved the sea, and he loved his boat, the Ocean Clipper.
Oh, that was his life. He was a workaholic, and when he came in, he would be at that boat, and sometimes it'd be going late at night, and he'd still be out either repairing his nets or sitting on the back deck. So I'd pack up the kids and the dinner, and we'd take it out to the boat, and we'd sit with him out there, you know, while he would either be repairing a net, and he just loved fishing in the boat.
48-year-old Rolf Bacher is the father of 2 girls and a boy. He spends 3 weeks of every month at sea, then hurries home to be with his family. But when he fails to return from a shrimp run late one April, his wife Mary begins to worry.
I just knew then and there that something had happened bad, you know, that foul play.
Mary Bacher's fears are confirmed when the abandoned Ocean Clipper is found run aground in shallow water. There's no sign of Captain Rolf Bacher or his first mate, the only other crew member on board the boat.
A Marine Patrol officer actually found the Ocean Clipper where it had grounded near a place called the Cottrell Keys near Key West. And his preliminary investigation was that there was no one else aboard, and it appeared that there was a considerable amount of blood aboard the boat.
Forensic tests indicate that the blood is human, and investigators don't believe it got there by accident.
There was a fair indication that there had been some foul deed aboard this boat by the amount of blood.
The news that the Ocean Clipper has been found quickly reaches shore.
I came back to the house, and the priest from our church showed up, and he was getting out of the car. And I knew something was wrong if the priest was getting out of the car. So I says, "Is my husband dead?" And he just says, "They found the boat, and there's blood on the boat, and we can't find your husband."
The first mate has been seen on shore and is considered a possible suspect, but police have no conclusive evidence against him. It's just the kind of case Special Agent Dale Hinman knows how to untangle. No bodies, no witnesses, but plenty of evidence.
Every crime scene will tell you a story if you're trained to recognize what's happened with this evidence.
Agent Hinman got her training at the FBI profiling school in Quantico, Virginia. She has spent nearly 20 years perfecting her craft, reading a crime scene and looking for the telltale signs of a killer. When she reviews the crime scene footage shot aboard the Ocean Clipper, she notices something. A drainage pipe leading from the top deck down. Below deck, investigators find more blood, including a container filled with almost 2 liters, which had dripped down from above.
Well, essentially, a person requires a certain body blood volume to be alive and to continue to walk around. And if the majority of the person's body blood volume is recovered in this bucket, then we know that at that point he wasn't alive.
Even though there is no body, Dale Hinman suspects she is dealing with a murder and not an accident. But she still doesn't know anything for sure. So she sets out to recreate the crime scene. An abandoned shrimp boat is discovered off Key West. The captain and his only crew member are missing, and blood has been found throughout the boat. Profiler Dale Hinman believes the blood will tell a story. Could this story end in a murder?
To an untrained person boarding the Ocean Clipper and looking around, they may or may not have noticed that there was blood spatter in the boat. But when the detectives first boarded the boat with a crime scene technician and walked around, they knew that something terrible had happened on that boat. But once you've conducted experiments where you actually use human blood and try the experiments and see what happens to the blood, so much can be told and so much can be interpreted from the patterns of the blood that's found on that boat.
Helping to interpret those patterns is blood spatter expert Stuart James. He's been reading between the lines of crime scenes for 25 years.
Blood tells a story in many different ways. My job as a bloodstain pattern analyst is to study the bloodstain patterns themselves and to make an attempt to reconstruct the case based on other evidence as well, to a point where we can determine, in some cases, a sequence of events, movement of a victim, movement of an assailant, activities taking place during bloodshed.
Looking at the photos investigators had taken at the crime scene, Stuart James begins to piece together what happened on the boat. His first conclusion, this was not an accident. This was murder.
It was pretty apparent from the bloodstain patterns that were present on the shrimp boat that a beating had taken place, and of course there was no body that was present at the scene, but the bloodstain evidence indicated that blunt force trauma had taken place on the boat.
Hinman and Stewart can get a better idea of what happened by putting themselves at the scene, at the doorway to the wheelhouse, where the first blow must have fallen.
The first spatter that we saw in the photographs was on this right-hand door casing.
Yeah, I have a good picture visualizing that here.
It was about 3/4 of the way up, and then there was a second pattern on the horizontal aspect of this door, and the stains on the top, they were elongated and indicating they were going in. The angle that the droplet struck up here were very narrow, very acute. So the source of the blood was almost to the top of the door, so that he would be in a standing position at that point in time.
Exactly.
The victim had been struck on the head in the doorway. By following the blood spatter evidence, Hinman and Stewart can figure out what happened next. The victim most likely staggered into the wheelhouse, where the bludgeoning continued.
Well, according to the photographs of the original boat, there's a pattern of impact, spattered blood at the edge of the console, just below the top edge. And that's certainly consistent with the source of that blood being at a lower position.
Right.
First,
so he's not standing anymore, he's bending down lower.
He's getting lower to the deck, and then underneath the console, there's another pattern of spattered blood, and they're originating from even closer to the floor.
The victim, unconscious but probably still alive, continued to bleed, filling up the bucket below the wheelhouse. But whose blood is it? Rolf Bakker's or his first mate's? Samples taken from the boat are sent to a lab for analysis and matched against the DNA of Captain Bacher's closest relatives.
They obtained blood samples from the mother and from his children, and by comparing those to the bloodstains that were collected from the scene, they determined that this was the blood of Captain Rolf.
Rolf Bacher was murdered.
There was a part of me that always wanted to believe that it didn't happen and that he was going to come walking home, come in. I didn't want to believe he was gone.
Someone had killed Rolf Bacher aboard his own ship, and there's only one suspect. First mate, Ricky Flowers. None of his blood was found on the boat, and as far as police know, he is no longer in the area. Lead investigator Jerry Powell decides to put his resources into finding Ricky Flowers and talking to him about what happened. When we come back, police begin their search for the missing first mate. From the pattern of bloodstains on a shrimp boat, investigators Dale Hinman and Stuart James have figured out how Captain Rolf Bacher was murdered.
An interpretation of the blood spatter evidence told us that the captain was struck while he was standing outside of the boathouse, but in the direction of going into the boathouse. Then once he had fallen to the floor under the console, he was struck additional times, that blood flowed at that point, and then he didn't walk out of the boathouse, he was dragged out of the boathouse at that point.
And the person who dragged him is most likely the first mate, Ricky Flowers. Investigators fan out across Key West to find out more about Flowers from the people who worked with him. As lead detective Jerry Powell checks out the first mate's background, a disturbing pattern begins to emerge.
Ricky Flowers was someone that at least our road patrol deputies in the Stock Island area had run into on several occasions. He had had his run-ins with the law, some of which had been semi-violent in terms of battery on other people, but he was mostly a shrimp boat kind of guy.
As word of the murder and the hunt for Ricky Flowers hits the newspapers, witnesses begin to come forward. Jack Kelly recalls coming across the Ocean Clipper and finding only the first mate aboard.
I saw the boat up on the flat, and I got around the flat, and I went up to the boat in the back, the stern, pulled up alongside, and this guy, Ricky Flowers, gave me the story that his captain broke a leg and was transferred to another boat, and that he was bringing the boat in, and the wind blew him over there into the flat. So we took the shrimp off the boat, or he did, just threw it on the bow, and I backed out of there and took him 6 miles back to the marina.
Detective Powell knows the story told by Flowers doesn't add up. There's no record of anyone treating Captain Bacher for a broken leg, and a broken leg wouldn't explain the amount of blood found on the boat. When Special Agent Hinman takes another look at the crime scene photos, she comes to the same conclusion as Detective Powell.
It's not possible to have blood occur in this volume, in this direction, and have it be from a broken leg. It's just not possible.
Then the first mate's story begins to change. He tells another witness that he and Captain Bacher had gotten into a fight, a violent one.
Well, if Ricky Flowers and the captain had gotten into a fight, then Ricky Flowers should have been also injured. But nobody who saw Ricky Flowers in the days that came after this incident, nobody reported he had any head wounds or wounds that were observable on him. So if the two men were in a fight, then why is it that the captain sustained every bit of the injury and Ricky had none?
None of this makes sense to Dale Hinman. It's clear to the profiler that Flowers is lying.
Truthful people recount eyewitness events the same every time they tell the story. They don't change how the victim left the boat or what the injury was or how the events unfolded. They essentially tell the same story again and again and again. And with Ricky Flowers, every person he talked to, he told a different story to.
But Ricky Flowers still hasn't told his story to the police because he is nowhere to be found. Coming up, investigators use television to catch a killer. First mate Ricky Flowers is wanted for the murder of shrimp boat captain Rolf Bakker, and a nationwide manhunt is underway.
This must have been so terrible for the victim's wife, not only just to know that her husband had been murdered and that someone was responsible for it. We knew who it was, but we didn't know where he was.
In hopes of encouraging someone to come forward, investigators offer a reward.
We really didn't know where Ricky had gone, and we'd lost sight of him and assumed that he had hitchhiked or taken the bus out of town.
Then, a break. The case appears on a national television show, giving the victim's family renewed hope.
I watched it just with my family, and when it was over, it seemed like it was 1 or 2 hours over. I was talking to my family, and they says, "Don't worry, they're going to catch him, they're going to catch him."
And they do. That same night, police in Georgia get a tip and arrest Ricky Flowers in his friend's house. Locked up behind bars, Ricky Flowers begins to talk, repeating the story he has told before, with all its inherent contradictions.
Now, originally, Ricky told us that the captain had struggled to his feet, wandered out onto the deck, and had fallen overboard. With a little more discussion, Ricky admitted that that was not the case, that he had taken an unconscious and quite possibly deceased captain at that time and thrown him overboard.
With this surprising confession, investigators can charge Ricky Flowers with the murder of his shipmate and captain, Rolf Bakker. But even with the confession, the blood spatter evidence may be needed in court, and Hinman and James are able to test their theory of how and where the crime unfolded.
We can do an experiment to prove that these are the events that occurred because the blood will look similar in our experiment than it would from what was in the wheelhouse.
We can certainly do that.
A sponge soaked with blood represents the victim's bleeding skull.
I have one object here, and okay, so let's see what we can create here with this. That looks pretty good, doesn't it?
Looks very similar to what was in the wheelhouse.
The patterns made by the blood in the experiment match the blood spatter at the crime scene. Even without the victim's body, they are able to reconstruct the crime.
The interesting thing about this crime scene is that you can follow the path of the victim from standing and receiving at least 2 blows to coming here and coming lower and then being all the way to the ground. So you can interpret the blood spatter to say with a degree of certainty that this is exactly how this crime occurred based on the angle and the direction and the location of the blood spatter here in this wheelhouse.
The findings are prepared for the prosecution of Ricky Flowers in what looks like an open and shut case.
This case wasn't a matter of proving whether Ricky did it. The 2 men were alone on the boat. There's no one else who could have been there. This case was more a matter of understanding what happened in the crime scene and finding ways to prove this beyond any reasonable doubt to a jury.
The task of convicting Ricky Flowers for the murder of his captain now rests with prosecutor John Ellsworth.
In this case, we not only had Mr. Bakker, the captain's blood all over the boat, we also had blood in significant quantities, indicating that he had bled quite a bit. And we had Mr. Flowers' admissions that he threw him overboard and no body was ever covered.
Faced with overwhelming evidence against him, Ricky Flowers pleads guilty to second-degree murder and is sentenced to 12 years in prison for staging what started out as a mutiny and ended in death.
From other witnesses, we sort of gleaned that Mr. Flowers may have been over being a shrimp mate and wanted to go back in. The captain of the boat obviously did not want to go back in until he had finished his job out there. And when he wouldn't let him go back in, Mr. Flowers became angry with him, and the rest resulted.
But whatever really happened, one thing was irrefutable. Rolf Bakker was dead. He had gone to sea and never returned to the family that awaited him on shore.
I just wonder what Ricky Flowers thinks. Does he ever think of what he has done to me? Is he really ever sorry?
For Agent Hinman, the case is closed. A killer is behind bars. But there are always some unanswered questions.
Everybody would always like to know in a case like this, what is the reason why this crime happened? What was the event that triggered what happened between the captain and the first mate on the Ocean Clipper that day? The point about this is a hardworking man, a husband, is gone, and there's no bringing him back. What was the motive? I don't know. Will we ever know? Probably not.